The study session for the City Council, September 4th. We have a full council in attendance. Our first topic is neighborhood traffic management recommendations, and our presenter is Public Works Director Keith Reester.
I got it.
It's good, and my custodial staff wanted to make sure they... So, Keith Reester, Public Works Director. What we're tasked with tonight is one of the, on every community survey that we do, always in the top 3 is traffic, congestion management, those kind of things. So, we thought it would be a good opportunity to sit with council and share neighborhood traffic management and how that's looked at and how that's historically been looked at in this community and what the tools that we have and don't have available to us here in Littleton. I always think of this, a lot of people call this traffic calming, which I just think is an oxymoron. In general. So we'll just kind of jump in. So our goal tonight is to really give you an overview of neighborhood traffic management, a historical perspective, what our toolbox is, and also show you some recent projects and initiatives so that you have an understanding of what it takes on the staff side. Because I believe every council member here, at least at one point in the last couple of months, has sent me a traffic calming issue. For sure. So we'll just kind of talk about what that looks like and the implications of that. So we might as well, this is our staff team that's really tied into this. Is Aaron Human, you've met, he's our traffic engineer. Tim Weaver, our traffic analyst, and Brent Thompson, the city engineer. As Mark has pointed out in a couple of times, we didn't even have a traffic engineer in the city until 2 years ago. So it was left to a traffic analyst, which is kind of interesting choice to get to that point. So at least we've got a stronger team than we've had in the past. So this is really the traditional definition in a lot of cities of what neighborhood traffic management is: a combination of policy, education, and implementation to mitigate what's going on with neighborhood traffic and motor vehicles. And, a lot of people think of that exclusively as either speeding or drag racing, pedestrian and bicycle interaction, all those types of things are tied into this. And the other part of this is, at the end of the day, it's also a feeling of safety. As an example, today we had a staff meeting on another issue, and we were looking at a particular corridor in Google Earth. And in Littleton, there's a lot of 3-foot wide attached sidewalks, meaning they are immediately adjacent to the road and they are 3 feet wide. The current ADA standard alone is 5 feet. And generally speaking, you want to go with a detached sidewalk because of that feeling of safety. On an attached 3-foot sidewalk, you really have an 18-inch travel corridor. Because people generally don't drift over towards the travel lane, especially on a high-speed corridor. So it's also about a feeling of safety when people are traveling around their neighborhoods. So really, we, like pretty much all the cities that take this on, have a 3-pronged approach. There's education, enforcement, and engineering. Those 3 right there, kind of education, enforcement, and engineering, are scaled in terms of the cost implications. as you go through the office there, after you go through the effort. The first one example is most people think of a speed trailer out there, you know, radaring things. That's an education device. We do collect data from that, but it is an education device for people aware of what they're doing, how fast they're going. I know when it ever shows up in my neighborhood that my 9-year-old likes to see how fast he can go by on his bicycle. So it does attract even the youth of our cities to participate. It also goes to things like yard signs. One of the programs that we've never had here is we just have a stockpile of yard signs that say something like, Littleton loves our kids, please drive safely in our neighborhood. That's something we've never had. We've got a program, we're preparing to order some of those. So we have a stock so that people can have those in their neighborhood. They can post them up and those types of things. From there, it scales up to enforcement with our police department because we work in partnership with them. Everything from speed traps, I know none of you have ever gotten a speeding ticket, so you probably know what that interaction is like, to a variety of different things going forward. The other part then moves to engineering, and this is where the cost starts to change. This goes from everything from changing striping to changing road alignments to a whole variety of tools that you can have to build out there, and I'm going to share some of those with you a little bit further in the presentation. Neighborhood traffic management really brings into, when we start to look at neighborhood traffic management planning, the things that are in there are, the roadway classification. Generally, you can throw it in 3 buckets: local, collector, and arterial streets. You have to have all of those. It's just kind of like your circulatory system in your body. And then every one of those, you've got kind of a volume and speed requirement. When you engineer a street, you may post the speed limit may be 30, but it may be designed for a speed of 42 to 45 from a safety perspective. And all of that, we all work generally from 2 primary documents in the United States: the MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. If you're very bored and would like to look at a lot of pictures, that's available. And then the other one is all the work that comes out from the Institute of Traffic Engineers, ITE. And this is often the basis of everything from planning and everything to neighborhood design speeds. We also typically work where, let's say you're working in a neighborhood and it's a situation where people are concerned about speeding, let's say. Whatever you get to from a solution, you want to get to a point where you have 75% of the neighbors in line with what's going to happen there and in agreement. If you don't, it can be problematic. And also, especially when you start talking about immediate adjacencies of traffic calming installations. You also have to have your implement toolbox and funding are always at the key of that. So basically, what's our history here? I included the current neighborhood traffic management plan in the packet tonight. Just by looking at the graphics, you can probably tell the age of that plan. It was crafted 20 years ago, in 1998. Obviously, our community was a little bit different then. And so at that time, there was some funding in the $100,000 range for a few years. Eventually, that was cut to 50, and for pretty much the last 14 to 15 years, that's been zero specifically dedicated to traffic calming. It's really just come out of the general transportation budget, and last year was the first time we've had traffic engineering itself as a cutout within the public works budget for the first time. We've never even really had that before. And we also have basically minimal staff to deal with this. And I'll show you why that's really important as we get further in. We also have a history of inconsistent installations. You'll see a variety of installations, some that seem to make sense and some that don't. As an example, one of the things I first observed when I came to this community is Littleton has a history of putting in 4-way stops to control speed. When you drive through many neighborhoods, that 4-way stops have been put in where clearly they probably shouldn't have, maybe a 2-way, but not a 4-way. And what you actually see in a neighborhood situation is you end up seeing people roll through the stop signs and then they accelerate out of the intersection, so sometimes it actually exacerbates the problem with speeding in a neighborhood. I'm not saying you don't use that in some circumstances, but that's where looking at all of the toolbox that you have. There's also been a lot of inconsistent maintenance over the years. They always have impacts. If you think of some of the speed bumps that are in this community, they're kind of like speed mounds, I think, in a few places. Those definitely have an impact on emergency operations, transit vehicles and our operations. I can tell you from doing enough ride-alongs that you do not want to be sitting in the cab of the snowplow doing 30 miles an hour and catch a speed bump with the bit on your plow. That is not an enjoyable experience for an operator. So we always have to take those things into account as we go through it. So what I want to do is show you, in the last year, the staff did a large, what we call a large traffic management plan in the Mineral Ave corridor. And we have a whole web page on this for this particular item. So we wanted to show you how that works. And in this particular plan, what you do in a typical plan is you go through the process of volume and data collection. You can do that through tube counters and a variety of other things. When you have two tubes out there, you're also measuring speed. You're not just measuring the number of vehicles. Speed data, accident data is a big thing. We have a great relationship with both our own police department as well as the other police departments in Dr. Cog, where we have a really good access to accident data.
So would you comment on how you deal with the volume issue? So going to schools, for example, there's a lot of volume a couple of different times during the day, and then in some places relatively little volume.
Well, I'll answer the school one a little bit briefly and then talk about it more later. I actually refer to it, and have for years, is that every day in America, in the school year, we have a traffic spasm in the AM and PM in our system. It's the same in every community in America. And it's been exacerbated by the fact that as much as 15 years ago, 60% of kids came by bus or walked or biked to a school. Today, that's typically closer to 85% are coming by parent-occupied vehicle. And it's the worst situations are. I'm not throwing charter schools under the bus here, no pun intended. The charter schools generally it's almost 100%. Typically it's 95% plus. The other complication in Littleton itself is all of the Littleton schools were built as neighborhood schools for the area around them and a draw from there. And the dynamics of the education system have changed, and that has implications on just the pure volume of vehicles. One of the other things that I always find a little bit humorous is we forget that every year about 50% of the student drivers age out and you have to start all over again. So they graduate and move on. And you have a whole new group of 15, 16, 17-year-olds that just got their license that are driving to school. You know, so it's really, if you think about it, anywhere from a third to a half are brand new drivers every year, which, you know, makes it even more challenging. My daughter's in that age range, so it's always, that's on my mind at the moment as she starts driver ed. So the other thing that we looked at, the accident data, one of the things that you see as part of it is our police do a great job in terms of accident data. We also have a database that we use through Dr. Cog where we compile accident data. You can tell where the turns were, where the accident occurred, and volumes over time, and you can see where the trends are. Basically, the top 3 to 4 of our top 5 accident locations in the city are related to Santa Fe, which limits our ability to go in and maybe tackle those. We can work with CDOT. Some of you, for example, emailed me quite a bit over the last month related to striping by CDOT on Santa Fe when they did the restriping. We made a lot of suggestions along the way, but at the end of the day, it's their call. So we also have to do this as part of our master planning for transportation. As we've talked about before, we haven't historically had long-term plans here for infrastructure. And so when you start to do that, it allows you to build in the planning ahead of time. So that when you're going in there, what do we want to do in a neighborhood to address long-term issues that we know are there? Do we want to tackle the sidewalks? Do we want to tackle the speeds? Are there things that we can do to change that? Do we put bulb outs at an intersection to have a perceived slowing? So you plan that into the direction you go. So what does it take? I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this one. So in the Mineral Ave assessment, basically the way this played out was that our staff went out there, worked with the neighborhood, we spent some engineering money, close to $75,000 in engineering fees to do some design work out there. And we have multiple designs starting from where we were to what we consider phase 3, which is implementation with basically a lot of infrastructure investment. So that study took 9 months. The phase 1 implementation plan, which is changing the striping and changing the signage on Mineral, was done. The next stage is Mineral Ave and Platte Canyon Road intersection improvements. Conceptual design is done. We potentially have a funding source identified with the state through FASTER funds, but we haven't gotten that full commitment yet from the state, so we're still chasing that probably $500,000 to potentially work on that. And then the third implementation is a much greater issue with side street crossings, realigning some of those types of things to better improve all of the flow there. But that one, you're talking about at least another $500,000 to $1 million to get through that process as you go to it. So what does that take? Like community meetings, design work, all those things. All the departments on the left are the ones that were participants in it. And we basically, through other tracking, it took 90 person days within our organization to do that work. And so the reason that I put that up there is when we start talking about traffic calming, this is a big resource take. You can't send a consultant out to go talk to people in a neighborhood about speeding. It doesn't work. The constituents don't feel comfortable with that. They want to see a face from the city. They want to walk through that discussion. So there's a huge public engagement level. The other part of this is, in the last 2 months, we have 2 people that didn't participate in the Mineral Ave assessment process now believe that their opinion is highly important and we should disregard everything that's taken place so far and we should change the planning that we've gone through. So those kind of challenges where let's say you do something in a neighborhood and 2 or 3 young parents move into the neighborhood with kids. The dynamic of how they perceive speed changes. So you may have done a lot of things up to that point, but you have new people there and it can move along as dynamics of a neighborhood change. So we have a strategic approach. We are obviously taking care of this during roadway rehab opportunities. We're doing a lot of this through striping. For example, in corridor studies, there's a difference. So we just went through the Bellevue corridor study, and in that particular instance, that's what we consider sort of a high-level planning document. The next derivative of that from a transportation side is to go in and do some conceptual engineering, which looks at the road alignment, what do you do with the sidewalks, where is the right-of-way boundary that's there, what can you fit in, and those types of things. And our goal is to become more proactive. We haven't historically done that here, and so that's why we're doing it. Public engagement is part of this. Obviously, we're all jumping into the transportation master plan. That RFP is on the street, so we're pretty excited about that. We'll hope to get that underway very soon. One of the also things is part of that, and I've talked with a few counselors over time, is if you think of the transportation master plan for the whole city, underneath that you need to have some specialty plans that are very specific from your core, and that would be bicycle and pedestrian plans. That would be transit and mobility plans, ADA plans, connectivity plans to infrastructure connecting to things like parks and the greenway and those types of things. So you build out sub-plans to that. The last time we did a bike and ped plan here was 2012, and they did a good job with the plan, but then there's no derivative of that, which is an implementation, which says, here's the gaps that we have in the city, here's the segments we need to address, and in today's dollars, this is what the cost would be, and then this is how we prioritize those and how we're going to attack them over time, whether it's during projects or standalones, or we chase grants for them. So that would be the next step in that. And then one of the other things that we've brought forth earlier this year is we created a traffic safety committee, which is a multidisciplinary committee of staff here in the city. Includes staff from the city manager's office, public works, police, and communications. And so when we get traffic calming requests in, the committee reviews all of those. We've created a standard review and reporting format, and we're working on how that communication cycle works. We're creating a new section of the web page to get that information out. So let's say you live on a particular street and you go to the website. Well, maybe there is some data there that was done a couple of years ago that you can take a look at. So that's the kind of thing we want to get going. The multidisciplinary approach also really helps us with that education, enforcement, engineering. You know, because a lot of times you go out there and you put that speed trailer out there and you do see behavioral changes. Or you have an officer stand there with a radar gun. You definitely see behavioral changes. So you see a lot of people doing this in their car. The brake shoes is the first thing that you see. But those kind of things will impact. And so working your way through the possible things to do, changing a little signage, changing a little bit of striping makes a difference. For example, we did the RRFB, Rapid Flashing Beacon, basically right up here on Littleton Boulevard. And we've gotten a lot of commentary about the placement of that. We did a lot of analysis from an engineering standpoint, and that's why it's in that location. The challenge is we can't change the bridges. So bridges aren't going to change coming into that intersection, which is what's aligning the cars. So, for example, if you've looked out there in the last month or so, there's additional stuff on the street, the 25-mile-an-hour labels on the street. We have a project planned for next year, which will address a lot of pedestrian and flow issues around Prince and Church and the light rail station and the pedestrian crossing that's right there now. We're going to probably move to a speed table, which is a little bit of a raised crossing, which will add some additional speed control through that corridor and do that. One of the questions we always get is, why can't you just put a flasher further up the street? Well, it won't be activated until the pedestrian actually pushes it up the street. So more than likely, by the time it's activated, the car will already actually be there. Because the pedestrian can't activate it before they get there. So that you have kind of this consequence of how do you do it. So we're trying a lot of things out there. We do a lot of observation out there, for example. So one of the things that we also have is we've added a transportation planner position, which we appreciate the fact that you approved that in the budget amendment. We hope to align about 20% of their time doing neighborhood traffic management. So we have a point person on this to allow us to engage more with the community. We're working through this year's budget process and trying to identify how we can have some set-aside funds to target this particular area from an operational standpoint for our community. This one can get expensive very quickly. As soon as you start talking about infrastructure changes, it gets expensive fast. And that's just the reality of building streets and roads and those types of things. So we've also, the safety committee, these are the kind of things that they review: signing, striping, speeding, record and document decision-making, platform engagement in the neighborhoods, those types of things is what we do. So what's in a toolbox? The image that you see up on the left is what a lot of us, what's called a complete street. And what that does is a complete street model engages all modes. And it goes from vehicles to bicycles to pedestrians and all of those types of things. And, you know, for example, on the bike side, I always think of bike routes a lot like ski runs. You know, you got green, you got blue, you got black. So a very confident rider is very comfortable riding a black diamond route, which may have higher speeds and more traffic. Somebody who's has young kids who's still learning to ride, they don't want to be on that route. That's not a comfortable route for them. So how do you integrate your network to accommodate all of those different types of users? So these are some of the examples of a lot of infrastructure treatments, ranging from anywhere from $2,000 to $100,000 plus. I put the roundabouts there on the cheap side, to be honest with you. The RRFB that you saw in the IGA tonight is $120,000 as well. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at from a cost perspective.
Please.
Yep.
The speed humps come in pairs, is that right? Or is that per hump?
I immediately thought of a camel for a second.
Are there places where there's only one hump, or are they always at least two?
It depends on the application. It depends on how the neighborhood is laid out. I know our staff tends to go towards.
You answered, that's okay.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, I think that we like to, professionally, I think we'd like to move to more of a concept of what we call speed tables, which is they ramp up, they're a little bit flatter, as well at the top. They create less sound. They run out a little bit differently. So that's the kind of model that we would like to work our way towards versus the traditional speed bump, which people see. They're a little bit harder to maintain, and they make a lot more noise for neighbors.
Yeah, because every time that comes up, just so the public knows this, there's one place in particular that we've talked about before, with the two, and somebody down the street and around the corner and on another street wanted speed bumps put in, and I said, "You sure you want those? Because I just walked down this street, and those people want them removed because the people seem to like to see how fast they can go over them, particularly on the way to a school, particular school." And so it was the thump, that aggravated the devil out of people. But that's one reason I ask is the multiples as well as the noise issue.
That's one of the things where that neighborhood participation is important when you're trying to come up with final solutions.
Just a question about you mentioned the attached sidewalks, the narrow attached sidewalks having a planting strip and have a 5-foot detach. Where does that space come from?
A lot of it depends on, there's really 3 ways you can do it. You can fit it into the existing right-of-way. Some corridors you have that and some you don't. You can shrink the street. For example, we spent some time today talking about Bellevue. You got a really wide street there. You can shrink that street inward and still not lose the speed or volume capacity on it. So those are options. Of course, the third option, and frankly the most expensive option, is to acquire right-of-way to go out and do that. Especially if it's along the cemetery. We don't want to be messing with those people in the cemetery and acquiring the right-of-way along the way.
Hard to reach.
Yes, exactly. Well, they tend not to come out to public engagement meetings. Really, is the biggest issue. So, what these next 2 slides we added in over the weekend with some staff discussions, and the neighborhood traffic management plan that's in place today has criteria about when we will take on the discussion of a project. And that basically says that the stage 1 and stage 2 you see in the plan, which is engagement, enforcement, and education. Stage 3 is building stuff. A minimum of 30% of the vehicle's monitors exceed the posted speed limit by 5 miles an hour or more. And so when you see the next 2, you're basically boxing in the street volume, 500 and 3,000. So the volumes have to be between those 2. You don't want to go spend a lot of traffic calming in a street that has 125 vehicles a day. That's probably not a worthwhile investment. You want to look at, the other one is 75% of the impacted neighbors approve the plan that you're going to do, and they sign off on a petition to allow that. We also, in many cases, you look for a share from the neighborhood from a cost perspective. That is very common here in Colorado. And then the other thing is, the last one is, there will be no physical diversion of traffic from collector streets into neighborhood streets to address volumes on a collector street. Also, we do not want to put vertical speed humps, those kind of things, on a collector street. Because that, once you get to a collector, you're looking at higher speeds, higher volumes. So that's the current plan. What we would like to... Oh, okay.
Karina.
Can you give an example of a collector street? Can you name a couple of those?
Sure. Parts of Prince are a collector street. Basically think of it as where a neighborhood feeds to a little bit more busy street that then feeds to an arterial. For example, you have several neighborhoods that feed out on collector streets to Ridge, for example.
So Ridge is not considered a collector street.
I can-
Windermere might be.
Yeah.
Is Windermere a collector
We
street?
consider Ridge an arterial. And that's I'll give you an example. That is an extremely challenging situation. You basically have an old county road with bad geometry, and you can still see the remnants of the county road where there's no curb and gutter, and those types of things. And so fixing problems on that road is a huge undertaking. We have some concept designs, but we're talking a lot of money. And a lot of the treatments that are in there now are not really helpful. And so the geometry also plays an example in a lot of, several of the intersections along there with people creeping up or creeping down or the angle it comes in at. And so you have something like that that's just developed over time when traffic volumes are probably a third of what they are on that road. Littleton has a limited number of east-west corridors, which funnels those people into primary routes. So,
Keith, I have a quick question.
Yep.
So the 500 number and the 3,000 number, are those based on city population, or are those just universal numbers?
generally, those are pretty close to universal numbers that we would get out of the ITE manual. Most cities, the delineation of local versus minor collector, minor arterial, major arterial, and we are bound by an expressway, which is what Santa Fe is deemed. That's kind of the typical stage, and those volumes tend to be the same.
Talk about an oxymoron.
Yeah, it can be an expressway at 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe not at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as an example. So what we'd like to propose...
Any question?
Yeah.
The 40% share by the neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
How do you collect that? Say there's no HOA that can't do a special assessment.
There's a lot of ways to do it. You can do a direct billing, you can do a BID, an SID, a special improvement district. That's occurred in this town before. Prince Street was actually widened with an SID in 1968.
Do we do that with our sidewalks too?
Mm-hmm. Yep, those are possibilities. So, hold on, we gotta hit the escape key here. There we go. So what we would like to do is, as a staff, we believe that there's some better criteria, because one of the challenges is that we can get 75 requests, but we can only spend so much time on the highest priorities. And so having a toolbox that allows us to box in what are the highest priorities makes a big difference. Because I can tell you that everyone thinks that the traffic issue in their neighborhood is the most important one in the city. That's a pretty much universal fact. So what we would do is, the first one on the speed criteria, a minimum of 25% of the vehicles exceed the monitored speed limit by 9 miles an hour or more. Now you're saying to yourself, we just went from 5 and 30%. There are almost no streets that meet that 30% barrier right now in the city. And that's verified by our own counts as well as PDs, especially in the neighborhood areas. We raised the top side of the street, of the vehicles on the street to 5,000. We just feel that that's relevant related to just the growth in volume in our community over the last 20 years. We also believe that feeder roadways in the vicinity of schools, parks, high pedestrian use areas are higher on that priority list, and that also allows us to chase safe routes to school grants. So the IGA that you approved earlier tonight is a 2014 grant that was captured. Actually, the city got it before the accident that you discussed tonight. And so this implementation is tied to the school nearby, and that's why the locations are there. Do we all agree that that's a very challenging corridor? Yes. We have a lot of challenges there. So in this particular one, that's a Safe Routes to School grant. We really have never built a Safe Routes to School program, which we need to do with the district. And the goal of that is to get more kids out there. It's not just education, it's getting more kids walking and biking to school. It's having parents actually feel that their kids can walk and bike to school, because that's often the biggest barrier, is parental perception of letting your kid walk or bike to school.
My kid's gonna start biking and walking maybe next year or 2 years, so can we hurry up on this?
All right.
I will add that Littleton was one of the very first cities in the metropolitan area that joined the safe routes to school, bike routes to school, and we did that in conjunction with Centennial. And so we were one of the leaders in the metro area to engage in that program. It's seen a little bit of up and down with some turnover that they've had in their entities, but so we may not be as active in it at this point. I agree, it's something that we definitely need to, but we were a leader in that effort.
Yep, so we want to, we spent some time with the district already to build that bridge. It strengthens your application. There's also the money's split between capital and education as well, and those types of things. It's building things like tires and TNT Thursdays, so kids are biking and walking to and from school as an example. We stick with the 75% impacted resident, that's sort of the neighborhood around it. But this goes to what you just talked about, Counselor, which is 100% immediately adjacent property owner / resident approval. And that's an example of a speed hump right in front of your house. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's two, so that's an additional criteria, the 100% is an added criteria?
We believe that's important because if you talk to anybody that lives next to like anything that's a vertical implementation, it's loud. And every pickup truck that goes by that has something in the back makes noise. And so, it becomes a quality of life issue for the people that are immediately adjoining to that location. And, that's a situation where you have a whole bunch of people in a neighborhood that go, put a speed bump in, but don't put it in front of my house, put it in front of somebody else's house. And so that's why it's important to have that approval by the adjoining neighbors in the neighborhood from a quality of life perspective. We still want to stick with the...
Sorry on that. And I don't want to drill too deep because there's probably some things underneath these that are more administrative, but we had a situation where we did have some neighbors come in and they did, they followed this and they had the 75%. And for whatever reason, it came to council, and so we put the bumps in. And almost immediately after that, we heard from two different groups of neighbors. One group of neighbors said, "We hate these, why are they here?" The other group of neighbors said, "We didn't sign anything," and their names were on documentation. So when you've got that, again, you don't want to see neighborhoods, fighting over things like this. So I think as long having, particularly with the 100%, having some way of being able to manage that so that we don't run into kind of the same.
That's where having that consistent program where you've got continuity of process, continuity of how you go through just the paperwork, how you go through the community engagement makes a big difference over time. And so the last two there are what we've talked about is the 40% component. We would really just talk about construction between the flow lines, which is your white lines on the side of the street. And then we would cover 60% of that, and then everything else outside of the flow line, signage, striping, all of those things, construction management, all that, the city would take on. So it's really not 40% of the whole thing. It's actually a lot less than that. We feel that that's part of the reason that most jurisdictions include that item is because it makes a neighborhood have some skin in the game, is the easiest way to put it. Because we have literally hundreds of issues in the traffic side to take care of in the city. And so, it's asking a neighborhood, yes, you think this is important, okay, let's be part of it. And also making that financial commitment answer some of that question about the neighborhood commitment as well that you just read in there. And then, go ahead.
You probably said it and I missed it. How do you define the neighborhood?
Actually, a lot of times we as a staff draw a map based on what we see in terms of traffic and observation. We'll typically do that with police. And then when we go out for those first kind of public engagement meetings, that map's right up there on the wall. And, we'll ask people, what do they think? Do you think the neighborhood is big enough? Do you think it should be smaller? When you're mapping that out, and that's part of it. That's part of the process.
Well, it gets a little complicated when, let's say you have a neighborhood such as I live in, which has a lot of old dudes, and then a lot of children now going to a particular school. So they're coming from various places. Now, they're not, some of those obviously that aren't walking, but still getting that neighborhood involvement is a little complicated.
It is. You try and do your best to look at where the traffic moves about. Is the easiest way to put it within a neighborhood. You can go out there and do observations. You can see during different points in the day sort of what part of the neighborhood is feeding it, what is not. That's part of the art of this, I guess, as well, in crafting projects and solutions.
What would the cost for a shared be for one house? What's a range?
Well, let's say there's 150 houses in the neighborhood. And let's say we're going to put in a speed table at $10,000. That'd be a nice, not really nice one, but a speed table in there. So then you're looking at 40% of that, which is 4. Really kind of back that down a little bit because we're taking some of it, let's call it 20%. So you're looking at $2,000 spread over 150 neighbors.
Karina?
The 100% immediate adjacency. So that one, let me give two scenarios. A scenario of a speed bump, that's, there's added noise, there's added kind of traffic stopping right in front of your house, there might be more lights or et cetera. And is it fair to ask that if that particular neighbor does not want that speed bump there, but every other house on that street wants a speed bump on the street, that you can move that speed bump to another location? Is a speed bump something that you have some latitude in moving?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, oftentimes when they're installed, they will be on the property line.
So
they're not right in front of a house or on the property line between houses.
In that case, then 2 houses would be adjacent 4
Four houses
on
would
both
be
sides.
right.
Okay, so my concern there is that 99% of the street approves it, 1% doesn't. Is there flexibility to move a speed bump?
Absolutely.
Okay. A roundabout does not have that flexibility because by design, it has to go in a certain location. Does that 100% apply for a roundabout as well?
What?
The 100% adjacent property approval?
Generally speaking, the stuff we have out there now is traffic circles. It's not what we really consider a modern roundabout. When we're thinking about roundabouts, an example, I'm not saying this is in the plan, but if you take a corridor like Ridge Road, you've got 3 or 4 intersections there which are probably really well set up to accommodate roundabouts. And that's typically the application you would see would be on more of a collector street. So.
My question there is, though, something like a roundabout or where you really just have one place where it can be put, I'm a little concerned that we're allowing those 4 houses to say no, because we don't have any other options.
Well, that's just true. We always have. It's our right of way, though, at the end of the day, and we can make that decision if we have to. And city councils have done that. I mean, if we get to a very controversial spot like that, it's going to be right here, at some point from a discussion standpoint. So.
This is mostly for people who are approaching us for solutions, and mostly it is speed bumps. What's the how do you reverse out of this? So, like Peggy said, there's some people want them removed. So, is the same process to get things removed?
To me, I haven't seen a lot of those experience-wise, but certainly the same process would apply, I would think. So, an example, we just mentioned Ridge Road. That's a place where we need to do a corridor study all the way through, look at the volumes, look at how the traffic reacts. It's also a transit corridor. You have to take that into account. You've got schools kind of adjacent to it that impact the roadway and all of those types of things. So you build out a corridor study with detail, and then you understand where you need to go from an engineering standpoint. These are 4 programs that we're engaging in and we're part of now. We mentioned Safe Routes to School earlier. That's a national program. It's administered by the state. The Complete Streets as well has been going on for about 15 years now, and it's taken a big place. Some cities have made the decision that any project they do must be a complete street, and work it into that. The other Road to Zero really has come on in the last 5 or 6 years, which is a goal to reduce the number of pedestrian and bicycle car interaction deaths to 0. And so we're part of the Road to Zero Coalition. We just got a grant with us in South Suburban, and we brought LPS into it to do some train the trainer education for community members, to do more education for drivers of how to interact with bicycles and pedestrians. Because there's a lot more drivers than there are bicycles and pedestrians. So doing that kind of education in the community is something that we're working through right now. And then bicycle-friendly community. We took a tack last year of actually taking the bicycle-friendly community rating form and put our community up against it, and you go get bronze, silver, gold, platinum, we're not even in the bronze category, and we've got a lot of work to do to get to the bronze category, because we wanted to benchmark ourselves and kind of see where we are and make that part of our game plan going forward.
A certificate of participation.
Yep.
Thank you for participating, sir.
Yep. And we have paperwork to show
Third
that.
place.
Exactly. Our future focus, obviously, one of the things we'd like to do based on the discussion tonight is, you saw the traffic management plan that's in your packet. It needs a significant overhaul with new tools. I mean, when that plan was written, flashing pedestrian beacons didn't even exist. So we've got to bring that plan, and we're going to tackle that here coming up over the next 6 or 8 months. Hopefully, more distinct standards, better communication and public engagement on this topic as well. And then we're also working on the greater website presence, the transportation master plan. And then really the question at some level comes down to funding and resources. As we said, we have no set aside. We've talked about some money for next year, but that can get eaten up really quickly on a year-to-year basis. So that's something that's going to be important to the success of this program. And what I would express to you as your Public Works Director is there are certain things that we get a lot of public interaction on, and this is one of them. This one is in the top 3 things that we hear about on a regular basis, for sure. Dang it, pushing the wrong button there again. And so this is kind of the last slide is, these are just a couple of graphs about, what causes traffic congestion in the U.S. And you can kind of see that broken out up there. And then down below, this one is really related to traffic calming because it's a very clear graphic of as speed increases, more people die in bicycle and pedestrian interactions with vehicles. And we also have here in Colorado, Boulder is one of the most active bicycle communities in the United States. They also have close to the highest ratio of bicycle to vehicle deaths. So, even in communities where that's a high focus, you're still going to have some of those things, and you don't want to have them, but that's part of that road to zero work that you can do. So, with that, hopefully we're going to bring you some information during the budget process on traffic calming, but we also want to give you the tools to understand if somebody comes to you and they start talking about traffic in their neighborhood, how we're going to tackle it as we engage from a community perspective.
A question from Jerry.
Yeah, a couple things. So we've had the flashers on Littleton Boulevard now for, 2 years, something like that?
About 2 years.
So have we seen a trend of one way or another?
Yeah, we have 6 installations now, 6 or 8 installations.
I'm trying to focus just on Littleton Boulevard.
Yeah, we definitely have seen that. There's, I think the speeds coming westbound, we definitely see we definitely see drivers acting differently coming westbound. It's the eastbound because of that visual angle where it's a little bit different. So you have different behavioral things on the 2 different sides of the road is what we're seeing. I do know from just talking to pedestrians in the area that they have a much higher level of safe feeling moving through that neighborhood.
So with that in mind, then, on the ones at Littleton Boulevard, then, do we have a number count on how often it's being utilized?
We can. It's a little bit harder to collect because a lot of people will push the button, and if they have they may push it a lot. It's kind of one of those things. It's not fast enough. I know none of you have ever done that with traffic.
Never.
So those are that's where we will do some of those. Some of the things we implemented this year, we've taken several schools and we're doing summertime background traffic counts with 2 counters, and then we're doing school year traffic counts. So you can clearly see the difference between volumes. You can pretty much assume summer traffic is background traffic, and you can see the volume changes in a neighborhood like that.
And then lastly, as far as the numbers you have behind you there, how many of those are actually caused because the bicycle their behavior was the reason of the accident?
It's I'm not going to speak for the police on this, and here.
But I just don't want to blame everything on the vehicle.
No, it's not. No, it's definitely, bicycles have to remember they're also a vehicle, and they have to operate under the standards of vehicles. And sometimes that doesn't happen. I do know that the highest bicycle to vehicular interaction where there's a problem is what we call a right elbow, which is where somebody comes up and makes a right on red or rolls through the intersection and there's a cyclist here, and because let's say you're in an SUV and they're here, it's really easy for that cyclist to be in a blind spot. And so that's the place where you see a lot of interaction and you see a lot of, more dire consequences. Is a pretty common accident.
So do we know, is there statistics on the bicyclist?
Yes, we can get you some of that background. I don't know off the top of my head, Jerry, but we can get you some.
Keith.
I know. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I may just
Okay,
quickly.
city manager, then Corinne, and then Kyle.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Jerry's question about Littleton Boulevard. This is before Keith's time here, so I know that the previous council, we put that installation in 2 years ago. So I would ask Public Works maybe to do a little bit of work and kind of report back the success of those crosswalks, because they were something real new. So we can come back with some information and be more specific.
And I'm in that area often, I think Kyle, you are as well. Because it appears to me I have the perception that it is a traffic calming in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see what kind of data we get.
What do you think?
Well, one of my comments was going to be, yes, I've been almost hit fewer times in the last 2 years.
Fewer times.
But it's still, people do slow down, though, every once in a while. People, especially coming up from Alamo up that way, they're, flying.
Right, heading east. Yeah.
Slamming on the brakes there. But, yeah, it's definitely better when people slow down some.
Cool, thank you.
Karina?
I have a few things. The first one, engineering. I recall back when I was in the planning commission, when we were approving plans, we didn't have a standard per se on what the sidewalk should be. We were allowed to take an average, I think. So on this, are we going to be, there's some work we can do now that doesn't cost money, which is put standards in our.
We will hopefully be done with those in the next 4 months. We're into our second phase with FHU on engineering design standards, which then tie into all of our planning and community development projects. So we're working our way through. There's everything in there from multimodal to transit to all those kind of things.
The second is coming back to the question on the schools and the stats that you shared, where right now 85% are being driven to school or driving themselves, and that rest assured that's going to get worse because just from personal experience, the bus routes for Littleton Public Schools have been changed due to the late start. And what used to be transported within a 3-hour period by buses is now being transported in 2-hour periods. So there are more kids that cannot take the bus. That means there's either more kids walking or it's more likely that more parents are driving. So that immediately has just gone up. So that's very important for us to recognize that is getting worse. And with the safe routes to school and education, does that also is that education for the children of, how to do a right turn versus a left turn and the signaling, etc. So some of those things that I remember learning as a child that I don't know that my kids are being taught other than by me. Is that part of that program?
Absolutely, yeah. That's something you build into. It's getting those kids out there feeling safe. It's that walking school bus from a neighborhood where they all walk together so the parents feel safe and the kids feel safe, those kind of things.
And then the third item I want to talk about, you talked about the traffic committee internally. But as we also heard last week in the budget discussions, one of the ways to look at where to gain efficiencies and resources is utilizing volunteers. And you guys have brought to us or mentioned, maybe we've talked about it, a transportation board. So is that a consideration for you to develop a transportation board that helps to work through some of this for us?
Mark, go ahead.
Well, I think the conversation, I raised this with council a couple of months ago. It's more about a infrastructure committee appointed by council that looks at transportation in a larger sense, the projects, the funding, as well as utilities. That's a suggestion I've had as well. Very common practice for cities to have that kind of committee overseeing and making recommendations to council on infrastructure.
From a staff perspective, I've worked in cities where we have that, and they're a leader in, discussions about what do you invest in infrastructure and those things. One of the things from a staff perspective here is, I feel like a little ways down the road, we're going to be much better able to operate with a board or commission or committee like that, just because we'll have plans to talk about. We'll have master plans and those things that just we don't have today. So that'll be a really good time, we believe, to start engaging with a citizen-based committee.
Did you have anything?
The other thing other than responding to Jerry's was, I'm very happy that we're moving towards having, a long-range master plan with this. But the thing that struck me reading the staff communication is, with the neighborhood traffic management plan, traffic congestion were the top issue back in the early 90s. I mean, this is not anything new. It's not going to go away. I mean, it's going to be there. I'm sure traffic is probably the number one concern in any community around the country. So it's.
And one of the things I often talk about when I'm talking with neighbors or people out in the community about this is if you take 1990 and you stick a pin in downtown Littleton and take let's just call it an 8-mile radius. How many people have moved into that 8-mile radius since 1990? And you have de facto volume increases as a result of that, and that's one of the things that we're contending with all over Colorado. There's a few towns I think that would wish they would have more traffic from an economic development standpoint out there, but that's the situation, especially in South Metro.
Karina, did you have something else?
I do, but
I'll wrap up, so go ahead.
In your ask to us, in your staff communication, you're asking for 25,000 allocation of funding, and the basis of it was to better match the resources available. So I feel that you are restricting the ask to what you've been limited to. So the question that I have, we've all talked about how this is. You've said top 3. I think some of us would say this is number 1 from what we hear from our citizens. We talked about the issue with the schools and more kids or more cars on the road, so that's being exasperated. So what's the number to really address traffic calming? Because there's more people moving in than are moving out. So I don't want us to get into a routine where we keep chasing this and can truly get ahead of it and make an impact. So what's the real number that you need here?
I don't think I can answer that question fully. I think when we get through the master planning process, we'll have a much better idea on that because we'll have an inventory of where we have the most problems. Historically, 15 years ago, the city put 100 in there. But part of that is also, there's a lot of other priorities and how those priorities fit together when we're doing the budget. So,
Well, know that we are changing the way we're doing the budget in the future, as you know, right? And so we know we have to make those tough decisions. And I think this is one that the stats tell us are pretty obvious. This is a high priority.
A couple things. I love the Traffic Safety Committee. I think that's great. And I think it's great that can also then segue into additional, like a task force that then can still be supported by staff. Because the most successful task force and citizens committees are ones that are, that come rooted out of high-functioning internal groups. I also have written here funding. I think that is important. And when we do our priority-based next year, this is obviously going to be at the top of that. And I think that underfunding anything is, to me, that's just wasting money. So I'm not interested in underfunding anything at all. And I think that there's also a huge conversation around like the transportation master plan and what that, getting that to what that looks like so that those roundabouts and things like that can be integrated into that, because as the population changes, so does the acceptance of things like that. We talked about putting a roundabout over there by the Home Depot and that street there. It's absolutely ideal for a roundabout, but the community went crazy. First of all, they threw the $1 million number out, which that was a problem. But the community went crazy over that, and part of that is just not having a familiarity with that, something new, something different, something scary. I just came back from the mountains this weekend. They are roundabout crazy up there. And you can see people that aren't used to them, people that are used to them. So it's something that over time people adapt to. But so that really needs to be part of we like to talk in these 20-year plans. It's 5-year plan, because that's how fast things are changing. Who thought we'd get that crazy ramp at C470? Then who thought we'd be widening it now? I mean, these things didn't happen even in my time on council. So that kind of stuff, I think, we are talking about this. It really has to go to that level. The long-range planning, and like I just said, I think that's absolutely crucial, but there has to be a flexibility that allows us to have a more nimble response when it comes to low-cost, quick results that are almost temporary. So right now there's a problem in the South Park neighborhood because everybody's cutting through because people are wanting to stay off of C470. And we don't have a solution for that. And then, of course, let's not even mention the Waze, the app Waze. But we don't have a solution for helping that neighborhood now. Once the highway is completed and people resume their patterns, then that problem would go away. So it's those kind of things, I think, too. Kind of temporary, semi-permanent things that we can do to help when there's maybe a 2 or 3 year thing. We may be having to look at that with Santa Fe, with whatever we end up doing there. And so while I love the long-term master plan, I think some of these shorter quickie fixers. I think also that in here, the safe routes to school is the one thing that really does focus on education, but that's really a lot more education for the kids. And I think that having some sort of a really ongoing communication effort and education for the community and for understanding. If you look at that picture you had about the speed bump and the snowplow. So people get mad because the snowplow doesn't come, but then they get mad in the summer because people are speeding. And so I don't think that there's always an understanding of how some of these things don't work well. But what you've got here, 20, 30, 40 mile an hour thing, that's interesting. And I think there's probably a way for us to have an ongoing informational opportunity for the community to understand this stuff, because I think information can help change behaviors better than another flashing light at an intersection. Speaking of flashing lights at intersections, and this is a specific, we have that problem at Jackass Hill. We've had that problem at Jackass Hill forever. And we have continued to tell these people that we'll work on it, and we have always put tape solutions there. Is there any technology where one of those blinking lights, where it can be further down, like around the curve coming up Jackass Hill, that will alert them that as soon as they bend that curve, there is going to be somebody in that sidewalk? Is there? Because I know you said you have to hit it, and I don't need your answer now unless you have one. But I think those are the types of solutions in some of these more challenging places, because we know why we don't have one there, and so we need to be considerate of those things. But those are the things that we have to, because it's just a little walking trail, but it's used by a whole lot of people. And it's now cut through because Santa Fe is stuck, is tight, so now there's even more. So I don't know if you have an answer. If you don't, that's fine, but you can email me tomorrow with the answer.
I can just all I can tell you is from the staff perspective, that particular location is receiving a fair amount of attention.
Thank
Here
you.
in the last few weeks. So at some point we'll report back to council on kind of staff's work there.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions, comments?
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think you need a have a push button, it's just a signal, 3 blocks in either direction that you're coming across it.
Well, they are there, those signs are there, and it's still not.
It's not a sign, it's
Flasher.
well, it's something more that requires them to basically stop, yield.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Thank you, Keith.
Thanks.
Thank you, Keith.
I'm not leaving, so.
I know.
No, you're not.
Oh, jeez.
So this is a
I get the
conversation.
secondary chair. though.
Well, let me ask council, would you like a 5-minute break?
No.
All right, let's keep going. Debbie, would you like a 5-minute break?
Will you hear the questions on this one?
Amendments regarding capital facility impact fee rates for fire and transportation. So this is a Keith and Tiffany show.
I'm just the support.
Okay.
Technical support.
Yeah, technical support for sure.
All right. Good evening, Council. Tonight we're going to be talking about an update to our impact fees. A couple of them, we currently have 6 impact fees, and we're going to discuss a change to the fire impact fee and the transportation impact fee. Kind of a precursor to the budget discussion. So a little background on impact fees. Impact fees were adopted by the City of Littleton in August of 2013, and there was a revision in July of 2014. What is the difference between a fee and a tax? Well, a tax has to go to a vote of the people in order to increase or change a tax for any municipality or the state. The fee is a little different. The fee is, it funds a particular function or a service, and impact fees are to be able for, help me here, Keith. Sorry,
A community to absorb the impacts of growth. As growth comes in, it's a fee that they're charged to accommodate the impacts that they have on the community.
So essentially, growth paying for its own weight is what impact fees are. The city does have them adopted on residential and non-residential developments in the city of Littleton. And as I mentioned, we have 6. We have fire, museum, library, police, facilities, and transportation. Currently, our fee structure, which has been in place since 2014, and if you just want to look at the totals for residential, it's about $3,697 per unit, and then for non-residential, it's $1.946 per square foot. This was based on the research that was done by BBC for the City of Littleton in 2013, and again, it was adjusted in 2014. We want to do periodic updates. It hasn't been updated since 2014. A couple of things on the horizon are the fire inclusion. We're no longer going to be providing for future capital for the fire department. Thus, we're not going to be required to have an impact fee. So we're actually asking council to reduce that fee to 0 since we don't have any future requirement for capital funding related to fire services.
Is this for 2019 or 2020?
This is for 2019.
We are going to be paying for fire.
We will be
Contract in 2019.
We will be paying for fire services in 2019, but all the capital that's going to be purchased is going to go through that contract through South Metro. We are not going to be required to pay for any additional capital like we currently do. The other one that we want to talk about, we've talked about infrastructure needs in the city of Littleton, specifically related to streets and infrastructure. So we did want to review the calculation that was done in 2013 related to transportation, and we wanted to update that to kind of get a better idea of where those fees should be in today's terms based on the projects that we have in the future. So we are projecting or asking for a pretty significant increase. Residential would go from $317 to $1,049. And then non-residential would go from 0.784 to 2.607. A couple of things that changed related to that original calculation is we did update the number of residential units in the city of Littleton. Recently there was a discussion on the housing study, and they mentioned that the number of residential units has changed, and so we updated the calculation to reflect that most current data. And then the other thing that we did is we added to the list of transportation projects that we foresee in the future for the city of Littleton. We had very few originally listed in 2013, and with growth through the city and additional residential units and commercial units, we've expanded that list.
So that project list was the one that you showed us a few weeks, a month ago. You gave us an update on.
Yeah. The project, the list basically, the original list was only a 5-year window, and I think 3/4 of the projects are ones that we can't do.
Because they're unfunded.
Because they're on Santa Fe. And so the second list that's in there now is much more derivative of what we see in the master plan going forward. From a staff perspective, about this time next year, we're going to have that transportation master plan completed, and we're going to be able to really base our sequencing and how we look at projects on that so that we have a long-term objective of where we're going and we can filter through that. But the plan that is, the additional project lists are in there are really related to things that we believe, based on potential funding, could occur in the next 5 years, potentially.
So these are currently unfunded projects you're accounting for and trying to assess the impact fees as a source of funds. It may not be 100% source of funds, but it's a source of funds.
Yeah, it's a contributor, right. And so when you look at the fee perspective from a transportation side of things, when you're looking at a project, the part that's attributable to the impact fees is basically capacity. A lot of times is capacity. So an intersection would be more turn lanes, a bigger intersection. Maybe you go to double turn lanes from single. That's where adding capacity based on the growth in the community is how you attribute the component of the project to that.
Sorry. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just so I'm clear on, so the residential per dwelling unit, so if somebody's building a fourplex, it's gonna be about $5,000.
Per dwelling unit, yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
Currently.
Do you have a
Well, I'm
comparison?
talking first.
That's just for the transportation though, not the whole thing.
Yeah, this
Right.
is just transportation, not the other 5 impact
Sure.
fees. Would be included.
Do you have a comparison to other cities or?
We do, on one of the slides, we do have one of those, yes. Yeah. So Keith was talking about the projects. So even though you see a total project list of 53 million, there's only a portion of that that's actually attributed to the growth portion or the expansion portion. So we're not saying to fund 33 million with transportation impact fees. It's definitely a portion. And that was another piece that changed from the 2013 calculation. In 2013, it was 7.2, and then after we added these additional projects, it went up to 7.5%. So this is just kind of a calculation based on the original one that was done in 2013. We left a couple of things the same. The percentage of development for residential and non-residential, we left at 66% and 34%. We did add to the list of projects, so going from about 10 million total to about 33 million. And then I mentioned we adjusted the number of dwelling units or residential units from that 2016 study that was done related to the housing study. So that is the basis for the new calculation of the transportation impact fee. So from 317 to 1049 and non-residential is 2607.
So residential dwelling units growth to 2021.
So I did a growth factor of 1.5%. So I took that base number from 2016 and inflated it 1.5% through the year 2021 to kind of get an estimate.
So you're assuming there's only 1,500 new units in the next 3 years?
Right.
That seems really low.
Well, as an example though, when we're talking about Santa Fe Park, we're not going to collect impact fees because in 1982 that was turned away in the annexation agreement. The Santa Fe Park won't be paying any impact fees when those two parcels come in for development because the impact fees were given away by the city in 1982 when it was annexed. That's in the annexation agreement.
Santa Fe Park.
That's correct.
Okay.
So that's definitely going to impact the amount of impact fees that we get in the future on any new development.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to make a comment here. You know, we're using the existing methodology that was originally created here, specifically for transportation back in 2014.
2013.
Keith and I and Tiffany, we've had a long conversation that after the transportation master plan is assembled, we're going to have a travel demand model, which will be able to identify very specifically what we see in the future for the areas of congestion. So the methodology will change significantly. It will actually identify very clearly the areas where congestion and growth will be an issue, and we'll be able to estimate the cost specific to that. That's a much more specific, in my opinion, defensible to the public of how we generate the impact fees. So today, this is a very simplified version, simply because we don't have the travel demand model.
We'll change it in the future. So this chart here just kind of shows a comparison of our current fees versus what the proposed fees would be. This is taking into account all 6 impact fees, residential and non-residential. And the fire, we're proposing to go down to 0, so there's going to be a decrease on that side, but then we're going to add the increase in the transportation side. So for current residential, it's $36.97. The proposed fee would be $39.75, so it's about an 8% increase. So not terribly a lot on the residential side. The commercial side is a little different. It would be going from 1.46 to 3.542. So that definitely is a pretty significant increase.
With residential, so it's per dwelling unit, so a 3,000 square foot unit versus a 500 square foot unit are paying the exact same.
They are, and you know, every municipality does it a little different. Some do it based on square footage. They could have ranges. It could be 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000. The methodology that Littleton adopted in 2013 is per unit.
Why is it that non-residential goes up so much? Like, do they create a bigger? Why?
Because they're a larger square foot, so. Sorry.
The bell tolls. Get back.
Yeah, I don't have it in here, but the percentage or proportion of square feet of commercial is vastly larger than the residential side, and so they're taking more of the onus, or they have traffic coming in to visit their business and going out, but they're not actually living in the city, and so the traffic count comes into play with the residential versus commercial as well.
This will tie into, I'll answer that question, and it ties into what Kyle just asked, is that, we have this methodology, several other jurisdictions are, maybe by square footage of the unit. Those that have a really strong transportation plan and demand model, it's often tied to the use type is what's driving it. You just, the IT manual will tell you that, allow you to see, you figure out a certain number of trips per day for a residential, and you work your way up. So somebody like a McDonald's is going to be different than a furniture store. And I know the furniture store, for some reason, is way down at the bottom of that commercial list. I'm not sure why, but in terms of in and outs. And so that's kind of how you do it. And then you do some modeling in there related to continuation traffic. So, you go to the grocery store, and then you go to Target or something like that, and you work your way through linking trips.
Well, similar to what we do for parking, right? I mean, parking is by uses. Is there a reason why you don't want to change a methodology at this point?
Yes.
Pure workload in trying to generate the rationale and the numbers behind it, to be honest. I think I instructed the staff at this point just to use the existing methodology simply because lack of resources to get this more refined, knowing that quite honestly next year will be probably the best methodology we could ever pick. And that's where the resource we would like to suggest to council we focus on.
I just responded to Karina. The transportation percent increase was pretty much the exact same at 230%. It's just the fact that the ratios of the other things that aren't being changed are very different. The commercial doesn't play, or museum and library and their facilities.
No, and I realize this is primarily a transportation proposal here, but we've talked about these impact fees, and I thought we were going to have we were doing a deeper study on these to get all of them adjusted. And because what we did in 2013 was literally create impact fees. We didn't have a solid version of that. And that was essentially, okay, let's get these in here. And that actually came from a citizen, you guys need to do this. And we had a lot of growth going on at that time. And so the idea was, all right, we're starting from, we don't have a baseline for ourselves. And so now it's 5 years later, and we do have this baseline. And I would like to see all of those change. We just added 7 cops and a bunch of cars and a bunch of radios and a bunch of uniforms, and that didn't change. And facilities, we know what's going on. We know that town hall is busting out of their doors, and so the growth for that, the museum, we've had to add a cop over at the museum. This is happening to us. Those numbers aren't moving. Those numbers need to move. If growth is really going to pay for growth, and I would create that. I'm just speaking for myself now, and if there's support for council, but I would create that as a priority. And if we need to spend $20,000 or $30,000 to hire somebody to come in here and do a 3-month study or 2-month on impact fees and come back to us and say, you know what, this is what they need to be and this is why, it would pay for itself with the first apartment that's built. Because this is a tremendous resource for us that is exactly what the community says development should pay for development and not come back. It's going to be very hard to ask the community for any additional funding for the $100 million of infrastructure that needs to be done if we're not at our max on this.
Well, and that going back to that originally when we said, directed them to look at the fees and things. And I want it 100% instantly, but we know we couldn't get there for a good reason. So that's...
Right, we were at the 100.
Right.
Kyle?
Two questions. When do you think this new method for determining the fees will come online? And 2, how often are you proposing we look at updated impact fees? Annually?
Annually. That's been my experience in other cities. I think the actual transportation master plan is matching up with our comp plan. So my guess is that probably late summer you would have enough information for us to kind of use that methodology and change our approach for certainly the transportation piece of this thing. More than happy to do that. If the council is going to direct me to go ahead and update the rest of the fees based on the existing methodology, be more than happy to do that. I thought I'd been pretty clear about what I thought the intent was, and certainly trying to address at least the traffic in the short term. We could spend, I have to sit down with Tiffany specifically, we would have to hire somebody here to update the methodology. We just don't have the resource, the expertise to that. So the timeline of that, and it's really no problem, but let's say you get that complete in the first quarter of next year, you could easily update your fee structure at that point in time via an ordinance. So we certainly could take it on if that's the council's direction.
That would help us out with our priority base.
Sure could.
Yeah, and funding Carol and then Karina.
Mark, what would your recommendation be?
Well, I think on the transportation piece of this, I think that using the existing methodology in the fashion that we're suggesting, I think that is certainly my recommendation. To do anything different at this point in time, I'm not sure you're going to be able to get anything that's more refined. The methodology clearly has to change in the future once our master plan is complete. So on the rest of the impact fees, that methodology, we'd have to, I think it's okay, it's fairly sound, it's certainly defensible. So I'm not too concerned, say, with the facility piece of its methodology. It's just the time and resource to get behind that and actually update the data and present that.
And are you saying that we could increase the fees for 2019 based on the current methodology?
You could.
So we wouldn't have to hire someone to come up with a new one in order to increase fees?
Correct.
Karina?
Thank you for asking that clarifying question. And the follow-up to that is I would support that for sure, again, with the intent that growth is to pay for itself. And I do think time is of the essence. because then once it's built, there's nothing, you can increase the fees, but there's no one to collect from. So I do think timing is, there is urgency.
And I don't have a problem with what you're asking for on transportation, and I think it's, it's something we can figure out, and that's great. But I think the other thing to think about when we did these impact fees is that there's a lot of other places where we can look at to place, to charge an impact fee. These were just the ones that were chosen. So we're having recommendations come back and ask about that. So for example, one of the ones that was on here was an open space impact fee. And we decided not to do that because we had the open space tax. But what about a parks fee? Because we're seeing these playgrounds and stuff like that are asking for money. And so that could be a source of funding for those things. And I think the other thing is to think about is, the answer situation, that's just what it is. It's very unfortunate. But we are looking at, over a period of years, there are larger parcels that can be turned over and could redevelop into things. And so there is still a very high potential for some good funding here. And I think, again, it's having developers knowing and being prepared for where our expectations are from them will also help support getting the right ones in, doing the right thing, having the right plans. It's all interconnected. But I see an urgency. I really do. And I think that if it's additional resources, I would support you coming back to us at a regular meeting on general business, an ask for, and I don't even know if you would need to do that, but whatever, to ask for the resources to be able to fund, and then what the scope of work would be and what the expectations and the timeline to either include making recommendations for new possible sources and updating these. So is that feasible?
It is feasible, yeah. And I have the authority actually to award a contract up to $100,000 here without specific council approval. But, I think my intent would be, I think the scope of the work would be very important for the council to actually understand and acknowledge. So it might be best through a study session, just give you kind of a quick update on what that scope is and the timeline, make sure you're all comfortable with that. Then I'd feel like, and I'd certainly identify the resources necessary to kind of start that. And certainly I can present that here fairly soon. I'll have to work with Tiffany on that. But if you want to expand the scope to look at other opportunities for impact fees, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Everybody okay? Thanks.
Yeah, and just one aside, the library and the museum get a lot of use by people who do not live in the city because they are such super facilities. So, as we look at use and so forth, I'm not saying they shouldn't be, I'm just saying that's a fact. So, and we have to do things to accommodate better, whatever, with that's a different issue. And I fully support, do this right now, let's get it going.
Excellent. Carol?
Yeah, I would like to support what Peggy said there, that the museum is busy with busloads of people coming from other places, and the fees they charge are extremely low. So I would like to look at that.
Yeah, are we planning on looking at our overall fees? Because that's usually part of the budget too, Tiffany. We are? Okay, good.
And Mayor, that's the point I wanted to just make here is things like the museum being used by other town folks, that would be part of our regular overall fees. We always have to keep in mind with impact or development fees that those are based on simply the impact of new growth on the city and having that new growth pay for those services. So as we go through and look at these things, whether it be, for example, a new fee for stormwater, it would be based upon what is new growth costing us.
Yes, and that's a good point because, in council, you'll see it when you see the budget, is that we do have fees for stormwater, but those are paid by current users, and so that's the differentiation. And so we'll make sure, and that's why it's nice to have these, because then we get a better idea of what these amenities we're able to charge for. So, okay, go ahead. Oh wait, Corinne.
I want clarity. So what you've presented here is an increase to the transportation impact fees and a reduction to the fire. This is going into effect when?
If council's direction is to move forward with the change for these two, then we would present an ordinance to council and it would be effective January 1, 2019.
So what I would recommend, given that we've also asked for the others to be considered and then potentially expanding scope, I do not want to delay this implementation.
You want to do it sooner than January 1st? Is that what?
No, do it.
I want to ensure it does not go beyond January 1st. These that we're approving today.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no problem.
But just to clarify, we're going to look at all of the existing ones in the existing method and adjust them along with transportation.
Yeah, it's two separate things.
Yeah, it's not likely, though, that the balance of the impact fees will be done by January 1st.
No.
That's my point, that work will have to go through a consultant here and have to look at our methodology.
No, not the changing the methodology. Using the current methodology to...
I'm still saying the same thing.
Okay.
The work still will not be done by January in order for January 1st to implement the update to all the rest of the fees. So I think...
we can do that anytime we want with an ordinance.
Correct. So after January 1st.
If we don't get the report till March.
Well, I'd hope we better than that, but yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And why can't you get it done in January? What am I hearing here? Not January.
Yeah, I just,
What's wrong with January's 4 months.
Get
her done.
Yeah, it's the availability of consultants like this who specialize in impact fees. So, this is a unique specialty.
Who did the was it, do we have a consultant do the transportation fee, or was that just?
Yes, it was actually BBC, which
It's in the staff communication.
Right, okay.
There's a few firms out there with the example data we pulled on the other communities. There's another firm that did that Louisville last year.
And BBC did it across all impact fees or just transportation?
All of them.
So you would likely use them for these others?
It would depend. We would probably do an RFP maybe to see what other firms are out there.
And that would start with the scope that comes.
Right,
bring it
scope.
back
We got to get the
next week.
scope too. I'll work on it tonight.
But so BBC did this back in 2013.
Yes.
I'm saying, who did the readjustment of right now? We're approving the change in transportation.
These two.
I did.
So what's apart from time? What's stopping you from doing that for just the police and the facilities? We don't need a consultant to readjust that number right now, do we?
Well,
I like that train of thought.
That's what I was thinking. I wasn't thinking who initially did this.
I like that train of thought too. However, I would caution you. There are other items that are included in the calculation for the museum, the library, that would take some time to gather that information. It's based on flow. It's based on population. There's a whole plethora of other items that are included in those calculations that we would have to reach out and gather that data.
Well, and that's actually why I suggested it, because Mark said there's just not the resources on staff. So essentially what we're doing is just saying, okay, then go outside of staff.
Yeah, because if we say do it now, that means something else is going to be bumped.
Yeah, and we don't want to do that because
No
that
more
was
bumping.
part of our commitment to
Right.
having that. So, all right, good. All right.
You had asked for a comparison of other entities that charge impact fees. So we included this list in our PowerPoint presentation. Boulder, Erie, Firestone, Longmont, Berthoud, Windsor, and a plethora of others. As you can see, we're fairly low, even compared to others currently today. So for Littleton for streets, we're proposing that we have 1,049 per residential unit, and you can see the others, the lowest is 1,000, and the highest is 5,908 per streets. And then on the commercial side, we're proposing 2.607, and you can see the lowest Lafayette, 0.15, however the highest is 9.77 in Berthoud. So it really varies depending on the city's needs as to what the impact fee charge is.
Why are we being so conservative? Is that a philosophy?
I don't know if it's
It's our
actually,
methodology
It's
more than
methodology more than being conservative. You have to have legal approve the methodology, and it has to be defensible. And that's the methodology that the city of Littleton chose in 2013.
Carol.
Others have different, because like I mentioned earlier, residential, some jurisdictions charge based on square footage of a residential home, 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and so on. It just varies across the board.
Councilmember Fay.
Given that, why wouldn't we want to change our methodology so that we could be more in the ballpark?
I think that would come into play with the scope of services for the next study that we might do.
Maybe I can answer that. The reason is, if you look at the methodology that the city used in 2013, it really isn't what you would see used, whether it be for transportation, police, fire, streets. It's not really what they use across the country. Your methodologies are more sophisticated. Traditionally, we haven't had some of the things like a comp plan and things that would allow us to use a more sophisticated methodology. As we get these other things, we will be able to do that. So I think you really are looking at two things. You're looking at a short term, which is let's get the fees adjusted, looking at our current methodology and our current levels of information. And a year from now, you're going to have a whole raft of different information, and you'll be able to move to a more sophisticated methodology where you can adjust those fees.
And more accurate.
And be more legally defensible.
Yeah.
Right, but the one thing for sure is we're not overcharging.
I don't think you're overcharging.
For sure.
So we could go up.
We're not overcharging on the transportation side. Be honest with you, I can't comment on the others. When you look at facilities or police, I'm not sure we're in a position to tell you where we stand from our peers. I do appreciate council's enthusiasm for impact fees. I do believe it is something the city needs to get right.
Yes.
We have to get it correct.
Well, look at the parks, they're, 5,000. So Peggy and then Pat.
So one observation, I think we're the only landlocked city out there. And that is one thing, because if you're not landlocked, you've got to expand all of your infrastructure a little differently, all the kinds of infrastructure. So that is one difference. Boulder, I'm trying to remember which of those that Boulder does. They are trying to discourage certain things, so they really crank some things up, even though they're supposed to be a logic very tightly tied to all those things. So if there's something they can do that to jack something up, at least if I'm remembering, they do it.
Well, yeah, Councilmember, I think when you see the new methodology here towards the end of next year, it'll make much more sense to you on how it's actually arrived. As the city attorney commented, the methodology that we have today is defensible, but it's just not necessarily the most logical.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with everything everybody's just saying. I would like to see something a little bit south of Lafayette, Inglewood, Highlands Ranch. I think it's easy to see those up north, but I think we still need to stay competitive with our neighbors.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Peggy said, that, these are communities that are expanding, they have lots of room to expand, and we just don't.
Boulder doesn't have any room to expand. But.
Yeah, Boulder's. I think what's interesting though about this is that when we first did the impact fees, there was a kind of a fear of if we went too high on them, that it would send developers elsewhere. Right. That is clearly a fallacy, because these communities are just doubling in size every 5 years, which is not what we want to
They're growing
happen.
in size, not so much because of their impact fees, but it's because of where the water is right now. And these are, and they
But
have,
they're not
as Peggy said, they have the
deterring
room,
development.
they have the room to expand.
Yeah, the fees are not deterring development, and so it is not something that would cause us to actually lose benefit.
Well, I think we just need to be cognizant of, mainly Inglewood, I think would be our biggest.
We can tell you what those are.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, Councilmember asked us that question earlier today.
Okay.
Englewood, Sheridan, and Centennial are all 0.
Okay.
So we pulled that data today. It was a little bit hard on short notice to pull all the data. So that's kind of what we
Sorry to compete against.
And are they really our competition?
I know. Yeah. So we answered that question this afternoon. So.
On parks, you're talking?
No. Impact fees. Yep. We spoke.
So it's cheaper to develop in those 3 areas than Littleton.
Well,
Well,
At least with impact fees.
impact fees, but it could be more expensive when they're.
Yeah, an example of where that's different when you do impact fees is, you asked the question earlier about the engineering standards related to that. And so different cities handle that differently. They may excise the road out of them when they come in, the widening of the road or those kind of infrastructure improvements versus taking it sort of a payment in lieu, which is what you're kind of doing in an impact fee.
So when would somebody have to have their application in order for them to, get charged these new numbers? What's our cutoff date?
We can make it retroactive to 1980.
Usually, impact fees are assessed at the point of building permit issuance. And so, what you would try to do is provide people notice that on this date, the new fees come into effect. And we do sometimes, we're gonna rush people trying to pay the fees, but that's how you do it.
Well, so the question is, should we have a quickly enacted temporarily verified one that would essentially give us a few months to get it sorted out?
Remember, it has to be defensible.
Yeah.
So that's our challenge.
Yeah, but I mean, there's,
Councilmember Cole said
I
no.
would think there could be some defense, right? So,
We'll work with the staff, and Ms. Hoonan, the city manager, and I will work to make sure that they're all defensible from a legal standpoint.
And high.
You would jack those
Found
things
the
up.
council's shiny object.
I can make it a little shinier. There is always the possibility of implementing these quicker than January 1. That is just what we're proposing. It takes an act of an ordinance. It's a first and second reading to change the fees.
Do it.
So if council was interested, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, if council was interested in implementing these earlier,
Do it.
Yes.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yes.
I want to
Do we want to reduce fire before then?
so
Or is it?
Yeah,
So the only caution I would have with that is with current developments that might be coming forward, they may have already planned in their financing at the rates we currently have. So that would be my caution of implementing them any earlier without notification.
I say we go.
that they've already.
We have the information.
Steve, don't they have to go to planning commission as well?
This will also have to go, because in Littleton, the impact fees are in zoning code.
Yeah.
And so, because they're in our zoning code, they would have to go to planning commission.
So the best that could happen would be a building permit maybe in October.
yeah, roughly.
And then, but that might even be for that may not have a building permit by then, it would maybe November.
And Mayor Council, I would really recommend, with all the fact that it has to go to the planning commission, I'd recommend that we just aim for the transportation to become effective on January 1.
Okay.
That gives us adequate time, otherwise I'm afraid that staff and we're all gonna be basically committing to you something that we maybe just can't do. So if we do January 1 for transportation, I think that's much more workable.
That sounds reasonable. I would agree with that, plus it allows us to kind of communicate the intent here of council here.
Yeah.
Of the projects in the works.
And again, I just throw a caution. I mean, we're really, once again, we're looking at our competition and we're saying, we're worth this to come to Littleton, so I mean, people are gonna look at Inglewood, Sheridan's prime for big development, Centennial, who knows? But, it's gonna hurt, slow business down in Littleton. Potential development in Littleton.
I disagree.
So the point that's being made though, the point where I'll take that point is we have to address our processes because our process costs money as well, right? So we are assessing an impact fee and that serves its purpose, but we do have a responsibility to address our process and ensure that that's fair and equitable and just and efficient, because that costs everyone money. So I know that you're working on that.
Yeah, two different fronts. One is that we have a cost of service study for our development review process. The second one is that we have a consultant who's actually worked with the departments affected by community development process to look at ways to improve it to be more efficient. So there are two ways we're approaching that.
Consultant fees worked into the calculation for impact fees.
In this methodology, they were not. But there is some research that I've been involved with impact fees my whole career, and there's some interesting research about where the cost of impact fees actually translates down. And ULI actually did a really good study here a few years ago where it shows that it actually impacts the cost of real estate. So it isn't the actual cost of the structure itself. It goes back down into reduced prices for real estate. That's a long-term view for impact fees. So I'd be happy to share some recent research on that, so the council has a better understanding of that.
Yeah, the comment I was going to make is that it doesn't necessarily slow development, but it affects housing affordability. And you can see that Boulder has that in Lafayette there, because as you charge more impact fees, those costs just get passed on through to the buyer. So if you got a $350,000 condo, it's now going to be $355,000. So,
but that's where you make them defensible. I mean, they can defend them on whatever grounds they want, but I think there's also a quality of life. And so when you have an intersection like Mineral and Santa Fe, that affects the quality of life, and we can't afford to fix it right now. So quality of life in parks where everything's broken down, quality of life where the cops don't get there for 20 minutes. So if impact fees help to support that quality of life that can be diminished by growth. And I think that, the other cities get to make their decisions based on their reasons, and I think that our decision on impact fees it was long overdue, and I think that I'm glad to see that we're getting it tweaked to a place where we can all be comfortable. Yeah.
Is this only for new development?
Yeah.
Yes, only new. Yes.
Yeah. And it's can only be used to respond to that. So a lot of things that we'd like to do, maintenance on this, that, we can't use it.
So, Mark, are you saying redevelopment doesn't qualify?
No, redevelopment would.
Oh, okay, I just heard you say new development.
Yeah, so redevelopment,
not TI.
Yeah, and there's some details in that our current methodology that when it comes to redevelopment, I'd like to talk through with staff to make sure that we got a defensible approach there. But that's a detail we'll take care of and share with council later.
Cool. Sounds good.
All right, are you guys good? Okay. Anything else?
That's better than you expected.
All right, we're adjourned.
Okay, thank you.
Just enjoy watching the